Hello RGL3300 students, Dr. Conway here for lesson 10 on pesticides and industrial chemicals evaluation systems. Don't forget that this week you will also have your quiz to complete, which I will send out on Monday, which is later today. Okay, the information on that. But today I want to just quickly cover off pesticides and industrial chemicals evaluation systems. Last week we talked about pharmacovigilance. Today I want to draw some distinctions between pharmacovigilance and pesticide industrial chemical evaluation systems. You have the slides, so let's just get started on that and go from there. All right. So, unlike pharmaceuticals, the market for pesticides and industrial chemicals is obviously less contained within a professional community. We've discussed this before. There's also, a much more diverse in terms of product and uses and scenarios under which they could be used. Okay, I mean with pharmacovigilance, of course, one of the major problems is illegal use or black market use of opioids and things like that. But within the pesticides and industrial chemicals community, the options for misuse of a product could be quite substantial by any number of different parties, and so the lines between post-market surveillance and compliance promotion become blurred. In our course, we've tended to treat them the same. The post-market surveillance is also with respect to compliance requirements, but the distinction becomes even more clear when it comes to pesticides and industrial chemicals. Okay, and we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go through, okay? And we have to realize that with respect to pesticides, to give you an example of how diffuse and diverse the community of users is, pesticide manufacturing industry can be placing products in households, on farms, in any number of different scenarios. Other companies who use it to maintain their grounds, any number of rail lines who use it to protect from termites and so on. I mean, the uses are so diverse that it's difficult to imagine a post-market surveillance regime that could keep a handle on all of that and could monitor all of that. And for that reason, in fact, it doesn't occur. All right, in reality, okay? I mean, we have pest control products from herbicides, insecticides, fungicide, insect repellents, sheep dips, fly sprays, flea powders, you name it. I mean, the range of different pesticides, which we call pesticides in general, depending upon the type of pest that it is intended to address. All right, and there's new pesticide ingredients coming on the market, even with all the red tape barriers, as they would call it in the industry, to getting a pesticide approved. There's still lots of pesticides that are coming on the market consistently, or reformulations of previous pesticides into new product lines. Okay, so the high diversity, the high diffuse use of these pesticides makes post-market surveillance a particularly problematic area, as we'll discuss as we go through. And industrial chemicals, of course, is even more so, right? We have industrial chemicals, there are thousands of them, all right, used from everything from households to cleaning, local, anything from cleaning agents to highly caustic materials used in chemicals used in, say, cleaning computer chips, to large volume chemicals used in manufacturing of oil products, industrial chemicals are virtually everywhere, all right? In the clothing we wear, and the synthetics and the plastics, it's just so wide scale that strict control of industrial chemicals in a surveillance regime like pharmacovigilance is virtually impossible, right? It can't be done. So we really rely for pesticides and industrial chemicals, at least on making sure that whatever we let on the market is for intended use, is appropriate for intended use, and volume of intended use. Because there's not a direct line that you get with pharmacovigilance, right? With drugs, you're testing them with very specific human health impact criteria, right? Or animal, if they're intended for animal use, impact criteria by ingestion or application, right? With pesticides and industrial chemicals, you're talking about such variable uses, everything from paints to multiple different kinds of uses, right? Not only multiple different kinds of products, but multiple different kinds of uses as compared to pharmacovigilance. All right. We know that the Pest Management Regulatory Agency is responsible for promoting, monitoring, and enforcing compliance with Pest Control Products Act, right? And a lot of what goes on with pesticide post-market surveillance is very similar to compliance promotion activities, right? But we've kind of tended to fold them in because the fact that we're dealing with all. For example, if you take a course on regulatory affairs that's only focused on pharma, your discussion of post-market surveillance will be pharmacovigilance. That'll be it, right? But because we're dealing in this program with the 3 classes of chemicals, and post-market surveillance for pesticides and industrial chemicals is very much compliance related as much as it is post-market surveillance in terms of residual risk. All right. So for that reason, we treat post-market surveillance in our program as including post-market compliance, but also including a complete life cycle concept of post-market surveillance. All right, sorry, that went too far. And you can look at the PMR annual reports. For example, the 2016-27 PMRA detected non-compliance in the following areas as being preponderant: possession of an unregistered product. Okay, those are products that are brought in over the border, or they're produced in Canada through mixtures or whatever, where they're inappropriately used. There's no registration for the product. Import and/or use of unregistered products, that's the major source. Use contrary to the label approved by PMRA. For example, if we're using the products that can be quite harmful, the specification of how they should be used, when they should be used, and how they should be applied are very specific. But often, can you imagine a scenario where a lot of the farmers would follow all of those rules specifically? Not likely. Okay, many would, but there would be many that will not as well. Okay. So the purpose of the post-market, compliance or surveillance activities in pesticides is to capture these misuses of products that have been approved for the market based on very specific descriptions of what the uses should be. All right. So that becomes the nature of post-market surveillance in a lot of pesticides work. You can imagine with that much diverse use from households to companies that aren't directly involved in pesticide manufacture but use in any way to keep, say, weeds or pests away from workers, or rail lines, you name it. Okay, is it in every case, is that pesticide going to be used according to strict labeling or strict safety data sheets? Right. It's not likely. So how else do we capture things in pesticides? Okay, we capture them through situations, for example, with poison control centers. We can get information on whether pesticides are being inappropriately used to an inordinate extent by reports from poison control centers. But those have limits too, because sometimes the characterization of what caused the poisoning is not that clear. There are extensive studies, tests on the patient are not done, or reporting is insufficient. I mean, there are lots of gaps in that reporting system as well. So we are often using other techniques, and you'll notice that a lot of what stimulates reconsideration of registration of products is actually third-party studies, third-party findings. For example, around Roundup, right? Most of the stimulation to reconsider Roundup and eventually phase it out, which will happen. Most of that stimulus came from third-party studies, academics, NGOs, court cases, things like that bring it to the surveillance. But the rest of the time, the surveillance, relative to the amount and use of pesticides, the post-market surveillance regime is quite passive, right? I mean, things need to be discovered or they need to be found out, but the channels to do that are much less plentiful because the use of the product and the users of the product are so diffuse and so variable that it's very, very difficult to track those pesticides once they get on the market. All right. Now, the PMRA also requires manufacturers and distributors or importers to report, okay? But significant data gaps can be anticipated since these reports occur only in cases where pesticide exposure can be identified as the cause of an illness, all right? And how likely is that the volume of those incidents is going to get high enough that people pay attention enough to generate a report? And don't forget, all regulation is political. And we've seen what happens in the area of pesticides in terms of the politics of keeping, say, Roundup on the market as opposed to not on the market. How much will Bayer reveal as opposed to not reveal, and so on. And so it becomes much less clear-cut than with pharmacovigilance, where the person died or the person is seriously sick from taking this drug. The prospects for denial are much less than you would get with the sort of discussion of, well, are you sure it was this pesticide that caused the problem? Are you sure it was not just misuse? So if they had used it to label, there'd be no problem, and so on and so forth, right? So I'm not saying nothing is done in post-market surveillance and pesticides, because that would not be true. But relative to the scale of the amount of pesticides and their diverse use and volumes of use, the post-market surveillance regime still remains quite passive. Okay. Now, industrial chemicals even more so, right? As I said, industrial chemicals are so diverse and have such massive uses. Virtually every one of us in society has something that is involved with industrial chemicals, or wearing something, or using something as a cleaning agent, or whatever the case may be, all the way up to some of the most hazardous chemicals that can be used in manufacturing processes or energy generation or whatever the case may be. All right, so post-market surveillance there in the traditional kind of pharmacovigilance, or even in the pesticide approach with some reporting, is almost impossible with industrial chemicals. There are so many, and they mix in the environment once they get in the environment. So setting up a regime like that is much more complex. And so the way governments do it is they set up reporting regimes related directly to regulatory compliance, very much the way pharmacovigilance and pesticides will. But the difficulty with that is that, like I say, there are so many diffuse players, and only the big guys are required to voluntarily report through ARET, right, or other types of reporting mechanisms for toxic chemicals. They're not, individual households don't report. We have individual households use a lot of chemical products. Businesses, they're not directly involved in the supply chain for industrial chemicals, but still use a lot of them, may not be required to report. And when you think about the diverse use, how much is being used throughout the economy in different spheres, the industrial chemicals through a traditional pharmacovigilance type mechanism is virtually impossible. So other techniques have to be developed, okay? And that's why Canada's Chemicals Management Plan, it uses monitoring and surveillance of levels of harmful chemicals in Canadians and their environment as the principal way of looking at what's happening with chemicals, industrial chemicals and pesticides, because that's included as well once they get into the market, right? So we have to find some other ways to do it. And so what we do is we do environmental and biomonitoring, okay, which involves the regular collection of physical, chemical, and biological data, so we can determine, is there something wonky going on with chemicals in our environment, all right? It's not specific to a class of chemicals so much as it's specific to its impact on the environment and human health. And so we try to monitor that to try to capture any things going awry or problems occurring through that mechanism. That's how we end up with bans on eating fish due to mercury contamination, or warnings about urban smog in the summertime, or stuff like that. It's through systematic monitoring that we try to protect the population and the environment from these chemicals in a more general sense as we do monitoring. All environmental media are assessed, including air, water, sediment, non-human biota, and so on. Okay, source monitoring is also completed, right? Wastewater treatment plants, effluents, and sludge through surveillance, through compliance, promotion, and surveillance in that way, right? Inspections and things like that. Environmental monitoring is combined with human health biomonitoring conducted by Health Canada in partnership with Environment Canada. Okay, so we'll go take blood and tissue samples from, say, our Inuit population or certain subcategories of populations that live around very contaminated river systems or whatever, to find out whether we're seeing spikes in problems, or, we can't explain why, DDT is still in our environment when we don't use it, and then we can begin to track back what's going on with certain types of chemicals that may be seeing blips in the environment, or unexplained increases in the environment, or unexplained increases in human tissue or blood samples, or whatever the case may be, right? And then we begin to track back on that. Okay, and there are broad categories of monitoring. Systematic monitoring or impact monitoring is typically deployed to assess over time, especially problematic areas such as stressed river systems or urban air quality, to determine trends and needed corrective actions. For example, Southern Ontario's St. Clair River, where there's a lot of chemical plants along that, is going to be tested at a much higher frequency than, say, a river up in Northern Ontario without much industrial or human development around it, right? The Ottawa River, downriver, will be tested from Ottawa, will be tested more often than, let's say, a river that is running through the Rocky Mountains in northern BC, right? So it depends, so monitoring plans are established by government to focus on those areas to see if anything was wonky going on in terms of chemicals. All of a sudden there's a spike in the use of chemicals that have been banned for 10 years. Well, what explains that? And then we have to track it back in a very investigative manner. Random monitoring or compliance monitoring is used in compliance promotion, right? Big companies that have high chemical intensity are required under regulation to report, but the government can't just accept those reports as always correct. They have to do their own random monitoring, as we do with random enforcement visits and so on, to test whether these reports are in fact accurate. Okay. And then there's self-monitoring of environmental performance. Those are the big companies, the companies that, because of the nature of their operation, must self-report their own monitoring, like oil companies, steel plants, coal plants, large chemical facilities, hydrocarbon plants, people that make gasoline and diesel engine fuel and oils, and these types of people will all be required to report to government, okay, and self-reporting to conduct their monitoring. And that relates to the one we just discussed, which is the one related to random monitoring, because the government will systematically set out in its monitoring plan. You need a monitoring plan, as we discussed in RGL3300. But periodically they will test these companies, right? No warning. They will just go do their own water sample, do their own soil sample, do their own stack sample, whatever the case may be, to say like, whoa, this is like way off what the company was sending to us, or basically considering an error factor, yeah, they're giving us reliable data. Okay. So in businesses, of course, need this self-monitoring, because if they're working with a lot of hazardous chemicals or hazardous byproducts from chemical use or manufacture, they can't know whether they're in compliance if they're not doing their own self-monitoring, right? And so, there's a lot of work out there to be done by regulatory affairs people working in these companies to make sure that self-monitoring is being done properly, and the reporting to government on it is being done properly, okay? So these are really key issues. But today I just wanted to give you a sense as the radical difference between what we can see in pharmacovigilance and what we must see in pesticide industrial chemical tracking, where the much more diffuse community of users, okay, and of chemicals actually becomes chemical volumes, that is, becomes so wide ranging that there must be sort of indirect ways to track these things in post-market surveillance and compliance promotion, as opposed to the pharmacovigilance community, which tends to be highly professionally oriented. There are direct channels of communication. You don't get the drug unless you get a prescription from the pharmacy. The pharmacy doesn't issue that drug unless they get a prescription from the doctor. The patient presumably is going back and seeing their doctor in some time if there's a problem with the drug, it's reported, and so on. There's nothing like that in pesticides, right? There's nothing like that in industrial chemicals. So government must find other ways to determine whether things are going off the rails. All right, so there's a whole area of expertise there in terms of tracking these things. If you're working with government as a regulator, if you're working in regulatory affairs with a large company, then you're part of making sure that the company is in compliance with government requirements with respect to its own surveillance. And then the government does its arm length surveillance through monitoring. But the government is also monitoring, poison center reports. It's also monitoring, third-party studies, which we have a history of dating way back to Rachel Carson and Silent Spring, which stimulated more action on chemicals. This is the way things can happen, right? Academic institutes or research institutes or NGOs start producing studies that say, whoa, look at this, we're getting massive die-offs of turtles or birds or whatever. What's going on here? Or when the government does its monitoring, it finds an elevated incidences of mercury in Inuit population, or in polar bear, or on the seals that the Inuit people in the polar bear rely on to eat, and so on. And then that becomes a warning bell that needs to be tracked then. Where's this stuff coming from? If we allowed this chemical to be used, only in certain areas and only with certain volumes, that can't explain what's happening here. So now we have to track back, is there illegal activity? Is there inappropriate use? Is it coming from out of the country? Is it transboundary movement through air and rain? What is it? What's going on? What explains this? All right. So that's quite a bit different than pharmacovigilance. All right. So on that score, gang, there's obviously, we won't have a Zoom call this week, but we will. You will have your quiz. And we will be dealing with things at the Zoom call next week, where I hope to have, we hope to be able to get the co-op people on board as well. All right? Talk to you later. Bye-bye now.